So the topic of this online CPD, the first one we thought we'd do, is relative age effect in youth rugby. Prior to Christmas time in November, we did a pilot study called Sussex Mighties. And the program was designed to help players who were perhaps a little bit smaller, perhaps a little bit less confident, perhaps not the greatest of tacklers. These are all their self-reported attributes of their game. And the evidence is that rugby is a late development sport. And then obviously it's a sport of size, it's a sport of strength, as well as skill. But because it's done on a chronicle, because it's done on a season-long time frame, so it's as a season has a start and date of the year. So the 1st of September is the first day of the year, and then obviously people through to the 31st of August the following year. There is an effect called relative age effect, and the Mighties program set out to primarily educate parents and coaches. We also wanted to identify players who may well have been at risk of certainly of reduced opportunities going forward, or perhaps of leaving the sport, and we wanted to give those players a special opportunity on the day. The overall aim is to be able to retain those players in the game, and even if it's just a short time longer, relative age effect does even out over time. So what can be quite a large disparity at the beginning of someone's rugby career as a 6-year-old will actually reduce over time. The problem is, though, they actually may have left the sport by the time that things can even out a little bit. And the research bears it out that players are born early in the selection year, late in the selection year, are more likely to drop out of the sport. And that can be even as early as 12 years old. And we know that 12 years old is pre-puberty for the majority, certainly in terms of where size and strength come into play. And they haven't really given themselves, and we haven't given them the chance to perhaps showcase what they can do post-puberty. Whilst on the day, the players went out and had a run around with some coaches. We actually spoke to around 40 parents. Martin McTaggart and I spoke to 40 parents, and the basis of this presentation was what was shown to them with a few adjustments as we go through. There were a few criteria. We wanted to making sure that we were dealing with the right sort of people. We looked for players who are currently 9, 10 or 11 years of age. We wanted those born in quartile 3 and 4, which happens to be between March and August. And we nominally said that they should weigh less than 45 kilos or so. Obviously a 45 kilo 9-year-old is quite large, but a 45 kilo 11-year-old, as it turns out. That said, so we did start with some criteria, but what became apparent was no size fits all. I think we understand that, but there's a number of players out there who, even if they don't actually fulfill the relative age effect criteria, and we'll come to what that might be later on, there's lots of people in very special circumstances. There's people on growth hormones, there's people that were supposed to be born quartile 4, but then were delayed births, and so weren't born until quartile 1 the following year. And then we had people who were born prematurely, and so whilst there was a criteria to begin with, it very much we did leave it up to the clubs to work out. They knew their players best and who to send along. As I said, the parents went through this presentation that we're going through now. Players went through a session outside. We did send this along to the clubs shortly thereafter, and I will send this presentation out later as well. But essentially, they went outside and did a 90-minute training session with some school coaches, some club coaches, some county coaches, and it was based around 3 themes essentially: what to do before contact, what to do in contact, and what to do after contact. The reality is a lot of these, before coming along, these players self-assessed themselves, and they generally saw themselves as faster, more agile, more skillful players. But at the same time, they also describe themselves as being not quite as confident in the tackle, not quite as effective in the tackle, and other contact areas. So what we were trying to do is to build upon their strengths. And I'm sure that we can all see that rugby is an evasive game, so people who do have genuine evasion and genuine speed definitely have a place as well. So we wanted to build upon their strengths, but we also wanted to help them with their confidence primarily, but also technique, and the two go hand in hand in some of those contact situations as well. The feedback has been generally pretty strong, although, as I said, it wasn't the purpose of the day. The purpose was really building towards coach education and an event like this. However, the byproduct has been, those 25 or 26 players benefited on the day. The aim is for the 30 odd people that may have seen this presentation at some stage, they each make contact with 25 players, and the effect is much, much bigger. So I want to go through a story of 2 players. It's just a hypothetical situation. 2 players, both age 9. I'm going to call the first player Sam. Sam's a bit bigger than some of the others in his year group. He has some basic skills. He can pass well off his strong side. He's got little evasion skill, but will break the game line on most occasions. When he turns up to a training session, we end up playing him with and against stronger players. We may well give him access to better coaching. We either implicitly or explicitly place higher expectations upon him. And then in that environment, he obviously makes some improvements quite quickly. Now, in this story, Sam's born on the 1st of September. He's the oldest he can possibly be in that age group. Coupled with that, he's an early bloomer who's 3 years developmentally ahead of his chronological age. So he actually may look like an 11 or 12-year-old. And then as coaches, maybe he's someone that we identify as a player who could make it. Second player, could be friends. Let's call him Harry. He's smaller than the others in the team. He's very skillful. He can pass with both hands. He can kick as well. Not great distance. Very fast, very evasive. But he does show a lack of confidence in tackle and contact areas, although he is technically sound. We might group him with weaker players. We may put him with less experienced coaches. There might be implicitly lower expectations placed upon him. And Harry's born on the 31st of August, 2008, making him, in theory, the youngest that a 9-year-old can be in that age group. Coupled with that, he could be a late bloomer who's 1 year developmentally behind his chronological age. He might look like a 7 or 8-year-old. Obviously, it's a hypothetical situation, and we've chosen 2 players at the extremes. But Harry might be identified as a player who won't make it. If there's any questions as we go along, guys, or any comments, then please fire them back. And then the problem we have in rugby as coaches, because of the nature of the sport, And because of the competition structure that has been in place up until recently, then we often confuse physical size with aptitude, skill, and talent for the game. But actually, this could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, where in the beginning, a false definition creates a behavior which makes the original false conception become true. So the reality are some of our decisions, are some of our players actually people that can make it or won't make it? Or is it the environment that perhaps we're placing them in due to this relative age effect? And then age effect within sports coaching. We do run for, however we like it, we do have a selection process taking place, and we generally select players based upon ability to some level, and indeed appropriate games. Maybe some clubs have a streaming system in place where once selected players are placed into streams, and these might be streams for a festival, they might be streams for just training, they might be streams for any other number of reasons based upon abilities and so on. And then these two players, Harry and Sam, may end up with differentiated experiences, and they may end up with different levels of coaching, they may end up with different levels of opportunity, and then they may end up having different levels of competition. And all those things are obviously important to actually developing a player along. There's a number of social influences which actually take place as well. Most of the following three things actually came from the business world, but it seems apparent that these actually are applicable in a sporting context as well, and something that I feel that coaches should be aware of. First one's called the Matthew Effect, and this is where those who are perceived to have ability are given preferential treatment and extra support, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because that increases the ability, which then in turn leads to more support. And so the Matthew Effect was coined after a verse in the Bible, essentially where the rich get richer. So an older player, he might be given more opportunities. That supports his development. He does get better, and in turn that leads to more opportunities. A younger player, not quite so fortunate, doesn't get the extra support, doesn't improve quite so quickly, so therefore doesn't get the future opportunities. Second effect, social effect, is called the Pygmalion Effect, and this is where the higher the expectation that's placed upon people, the better their performance. And again, those who have perceived to have more ability are given more attention, and perhaps those who don't get that attention feel neglected. And then if we think that this applies to sport, we can see why people might start to leave the game. And then the last social influence that may be applicable into sports is called the Galatea Effect. And a player might see that he or she is able to perform better than other people in the team. They may start to, as they become more socially aware, understand they may have certain skills, certain advantages, even though that may be due to early maturation out of their control. And then their players' opinion about their ability and their own expectations about their performance can then largely determine that performance. So with youth athletes, the theory that comes from UK, Sports Coach UK, is that a sports performance for a youth player, 50% of it is skill and attribute, and 50% of it is behaviours and attitude. And so clearly, if you believe that you are good at something, then that goes a long way to actually helping you to become good at something. So if we return then to our players, Harry and Sam. So after giving Sam, who's the older one, every possible benefit, and then limiting Harry's chances, and Harry was the younger one in that our example, we give Sam better coaching. Sam comes along, he's bigger, he looks more athletic, he moves better, he's stronger in contact, he's more confident. And we say, oh, you're a good rugby player, so why don't you come over here with this coach, who's our lead coach. That then may lead to more opportunities to play. Sam may be selected to play in more games, maybe selected to learn new skills. He probably gets encouragement from that, both from himself and from others. And indeed, there's an expectation that goes along with that he would have started to pick up on. And indeed, the younger player doesn't quite get the best coach, might get the good willing, but parent helper, might not quite get the technical coaching that other groups are getting, playing some games, festivals, tournaments, whatever's going on, might not get the same level of encouragement, and then because of that may not feel that the expectation is that high, then that obviously limits Harry's chances as well. What then happens is if we think back to that prediction that, oh, this is a player that could make it, this is a player that might not make it, that coaches then use that to validate their original view. So that when Sam does make it, having given him every possible opportunity, and Harry doesn't make it, having limited the opportunities, the coaches use that to validate the original view, and then they end up saying, see, I was right. Again, any questions so far, guys, or any comments or observations, fire them in. So we've talked a little bit about what relative age effect is. Haven't actually defined what it is yet, so I'm going to go through and do that now. So relative age effect refers to the age variation among children in the same age group, resulting from different birth dates. So whoever class is composed of children who turn 6 between September the 1st of the school year and 31st the following year, they have approximately a 1-year relative age advantage over the children born in August. So a 5.5-year-old child going to school with a 6.5-year-old has an 18% maturational disadvantage. And if we think about almost any activity, then a participant who's 18% faster, smarter, bigger, stronger, then that's clearly a significant advantage in sport. I think clearly it's an adult event, but an 18%, you think, Usain Bolt, who is 18% faster than any opposition, then that's obviously the difference between day and night in that particular sport. So 18% in the sports context is an enormous amount. If you think that Clive Woodward was looking for 1% all over the place, 18% is enormous. Again, clearly that levels out as time goes on. And then just to help visualize that, it was quite interesting talking to the parents in the room when we delivered this talk. There were parents in the room, and again, this was targeted at parents of children who were quartile 3 and 4, and these were children who were 9, 10, and 11 years old. And there were some parents in the room who had not heard of relative age effect and had not quite realised what that may mean in a classroom setting or in a sports setting where children are grouped in this particular way. So we look at these two 10-year-old, these are 10-year-olds, for example. Then the person on the left, 10 years, 11 months, 364 days. So that's 3,453 days old versus down to our other player at the far end on the right-hand side, exactly 10 years, born on the 31st of August, 3,088 days old. So within that range, there can be, if we look at it, there can be a 20 centimetre height difference and up to 27 kilos in weight difference. And of course, it's approximately about a 10% age difference if you look at the number of days that are there. And again, that all adds up, especially at this sort of age, if you've got more opportunities, a bit more confident what's going on. Doug, I can see your question there about under 13 academy levels, and I will come to that in due course. So in theory, then, these photos that should be coming up onto your screens are players that are all the same age. And we can see that there is indeed that physical difference within the same age band. I believe the rugby, I think it's rugby league, the one that's top middle. I believe it's an under 10 game. I believe it's from Australia. And of course, there's lots of different ways to measure age. And yet we are very much focused on one. We measure people chronologically. How long has an individual lived in years, months, and days? And for lots of things, it works really, really well, especially when you've got large countries, large schools, and you need to bracket people in an appropriate way. But there are other ways to go about it. We might look at their developmental age. What's their age physically? And as we said before, that can be several years difference. We could have our 9-year-old looking like a 12-year-old. We could have our 9-year-old looking more like a 7-year-old. There might be a skeletal age that we could look at relating to bone growth, growth plates, and ossification of those. We could look at a biological age. What's the maturity of the athlete, depending upon whether they're pre-adolescent, adolescent, or adult. Mental age. Just because somebody is chronologically of a certain age does not mean to say that they are the same age mentally or indeed emotionally. General training age could be important to consider. People, especially where we encourage, and it's seen as good practice, to encourage children to lots of different sports, we may well be meeting children that are have a reasonable background in sport training and so on before they come to rugby. I know of some gymnasts, for example, who are very well developed, very strong, but are also very, very young. They may not be great rugby players, but they've certainly, their training age is significant. They have put in a lot of work in terms of strength and conditioning prior to coming to rugby and experiencing rugby. Then you may have people with a sport-specific training age. So we may have players in our groups that have done a lot of rugby, have been playing rugby since they were ever allowed to, maybe even as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old in a club, moving into tag and then coming through. And then equally, those players who have lots of rugby experience and sport-specific training may well be meeting players who have never played before. And just to repeat, there can be a several years difference between chronological and developmental age. And then part of it was, part of the rule changes, part of the law changes, part of the festival tournament changes were put in place with the purpose of reducing the need for some of this. If there are no tournaments to win, will clubs and teams and coaches and so on put out teams that actually are designed to win? If that's not needed, will that happen anymore? So I'm interested to hear your thoughts at some stage as to whether you feel anything has changed this season within the mini and youth game. We do have some stats from within the county which highlight that it is an issue for us. It's not something that we've looked at before, so it's just really a starting point. There are a couple of things to remember as we go through. So the graph you're seeing on your screen now, you can see that it's based upon quartiles of birth. So quartile 1 is born September through the early part of the year. through to quartile 3 and 4, which we see quartile 3 starts in March and quartile 4 starts in June, I think May, June, July and August. So you can see that within our non-selective district program, which we've been running for the last 3 or 4 years, we did capture all the birth dates as we went through, and we can see that even in a non-selective program, it was not important whether anybody particularly could play, couldn't play, etc. It was very much, if you wanted to come along, you were allowed to come along. All you had to do was to register, really. We can see that in a program that's designed for under 13 to under 15-year-olds, that 36% of the participants were from quartile 1, 24 from quartile 2, 20 from quartile 3, and 20 from quartile 4. So the majority are actually coming from, quartile 1 and 2. 60% are coming from quartile 1 and 2. So this is in a non-selective program. My antenna are up that perhaps these quartile 3 and 4 players are out of the game. They're not even there to come forward in any great numbers. A couple of things to remember. That birthdays are not particularly evenly distributed throughout the year. There are more births in the summer months, but it's not the same shape as this graph. So you wouldn't necessarily be looking for a 25% each nicely evened quartered pie graph in any case. And then the second thing to remember, more so with the following slide, is what the purpose and the outcome of the program was, and indeed what the interpretation of those who registered, what they thought it was going to be as well. That didn't always match up. And then within representative teams, and again, if we think of what the purpose of this more so was than is, there used to be, when we started to collect this data, this was people that were moving towards an England under-16 team, a divisional under-16 team, a divisional under-18 side, an England under-18 side, counties, those sorts of things. So the purpose of this is slightly sharper than perhaps the other one, but we can see that 42% of our nominations for this, so this is people that were actually nominated to go through. I don't have any figures for who actually played each game as we went through, but I think the picture's fairly clear anyway. So we can see that 42% of them are from quartile 1, and then 22, 21, and then 15 down to quartile 4. Again, we wouldn't expect the distribution to be even exactly, but I think it's quite clear that we can see that those quartile 1 players, and again, we may think back to the opportunities they were given, they still managed to come through quite strongly as a representative team. So it's really important for us going forward. Part of the reason for starting the district program was to identify some of these other players, just to meet them early, and to give them a positive county experience, and to be able to keep track of them and see where they end up as we go through. And then the Mighties project came out of that as well. So to answer your question then, Doug, yes, it is happening in the academies. The Harlequins, for example, they try and limit it by, when they do trials, they are done on quartiles. So, and we've done this before as well. We've done this as a county. So they might get 100 people to join on the night, and then they'll split them up by quartiles. So there might be a couple of quartile 1, and might be a couple of quartile 1 groups, because again, we know that there are more quartile 1s coming along, a quartile 1, a 2 group, and then there might be a sliding scale down to being a quartile 4 group. And then what Quins end up looking for is they're looking for the best players from each of those groups, really. So whilst they are competing for places and attention as a whole group, they're also very much looked at within that group. So what are they doing against people of a comparable age and indeed a comparable size? Within that, of course, I mean, it's entirely possible to get some very, very strong players coming out of quartile 4. And as we said, there's not one size fits all, but it's quite clear that the bigger your groups and the longer that you look at this research, then that pattern is very, very clear. So hopefully that answers your question there, Doug. But it does happen, but unfortunately the purpose and the outcome of the program are slightly skew that as well, perhaps. And I think we've got to be very clear what each level of our pathway is designed for. And for the vast majority of us within the county, within clubs and within schools, we're very much dealing with sampling players and learning players who are there for social and recreational reasons. And if that is the case, what is the sporting opportunities and the sporting environment that we should be serving up to them? If somebody has genuine talent and genuine aptitude for the game, then there are other programs that those players should go into in order to support their development in the right way. I think there's often an issue when groups and teams try and become the direct link to England and wanting players to be selected for the England team out of their local local competition. It just doesn't quite happen like that, really. And I think we need to be aware of what the purpose of each part of the game is. So for me, the purpose of mini rugby in the county and indeed youth rugby is essentially mass participation and mass enjoyment. And we just need to get as many people playing as we possibly can. Out of that, we then have county programs, we then have district programs, maybe. We then have the Harlequins program, and then beyond Harlequins into their academy, junior EPDG, and so on. So that pathway does exist for people who have a genuine talent. There is a feeling to really delay this. There was a talent symposium a few years ago now, and the evidence is quite clear that a lot of these rugby decisions need to be made after the age of 16. 16 at the earliest, because of this relative age effect and pubertal changes and so on, to give people the best chance. So I painted a bit of a bad picture, but it's not all bad news. So some studies have found that these young athletes who can overcome the effects of relative age often become the most successful professional athletes based upon average salary from soccer, length of career in handball, and draft position in the NHL. So the hypothesis is that, and I think we probably anecdotally understand this and instinctively understand the situation, that the hypothesis is that relatively younger athletes who are able to continue in a system that may well be biased towards their relatively older counterparts may end up developing superior skills through competing against larger, more capable opponents during key stages of development. It's quite a wordy sentence. So if I was to put in my own words, those players who perhaps don't have the physical advantages early on, they need to come up with solutions. They need to develop ways to play. They might need to develop ways to stay in the game and survive. They will either have to get faster, have to get more evasive, have to be more skillful. And as it turns out, those things are no bad thing later on, especially once we end up getting in front of people who are looking for those things we go through. So Giles, I can see your question there. I think I have answered that earlier, just with the before. So do we know for sure the DPP was non-selected in all clubs? No, we don't. The reality is that what was sent out was obviously black and white on a page. I think there are some clubs that saw it as a bonus opportunity, but I'm quite clear on that. And then how to quit and select academy players? Well, as I said, they on a day they will have 4 groups by quartile, and then selecting the best players from each quartile, up to say around 25 people or so. There's some other studies. They've done some studies in tennis, and they looked at 1,000 players, ages 12 to 13 in 50 different countries. And in that group, there were such future stars as Roger Federer, Kim Clijsters, and so on. And this tennis study found that the ones who made it to the top 100 rankings were typically 3 or 4 months younger than the mean age for their group, slimmer, less powerful than their year group, faster and more agile, and parents were supportive but not overly involved. And then in football, 2006 study, 55 Serbian under-14 players. They looked at skeletal age rates. Interesting to look at that. We talked about chronological. It's been a different example. So 44% were early maturers, 35% neutral, 20 were late maturers. But they then tracked those through. So 6 years later, of the 55, 16 had signed professional contracts. 11 of those were regarded as early maturers in the first stage, 38 neutral, but 60% of the elite players coming out of that group came from only 20% of the original group, so the relatively young ones. There's no evidence in rugby at the moment. There's a guy called Kevin Till who's doing quite a lot of work on relative age effect in the rugby league, but again, that's a different sport, I suppose, as well. So, Giles, just coming back to your question, how are they identified in a training session? You test my memory here, but essentially they go through and do a speed test, do a repeated speed endurance test. There are then games that look at their handling skills, spatial awareness, defensive skills, and in the past couple of years they've also done I remember doing some tennis catching one year, and just a different sport, so some cricket catching, and also just some general movement things. So whilst Quins are very much a rugby club, they are increasingly becoming aware of this sort of, this state of things, and they are definitely leading it as well. And so they're looking for athletes. They're looking for athletes who could potential to be good players as well. So it's not all rugby based. I know of players who have a strong gymnastic background who hadn't played quite a bit of rugby, but they were doing gymnastics at a very high level. They were involved in the Quins program on the basis of that sport as much as anything else. There were, hand on heart, there were probably better rugby players there than this particular individual, but they acknowledged again that some of the attributes and experiences that this particular player had earlier. So, Giles, hopefully that answers your question there. So as a game, then we need to think about some possible solutions. As I said, at the moment, in a big country, we tend to stick to year banding. It's the easiest and simplest thing to do. But perhaps the age bands need to be wider. Perhaps if they were bigger than 12 months, if they're 18 months, if they're 24 months, if they're 6 months, then maybe that starts to eliminate some of this relative age effect and the wide range of people you get within this group. Throughout a season, there could be a system called relative age fair, and that's a system where, and football did a little bit of stuff on this, that rather than having a single age point that starts the season, that age point changes throughout the season. So if I said that potentially competition 1 starts in September, and that's for the people that were born in September, they're the oldest people, but then maybe in December competition 2 starts, and then the oldest people allowed to play in competition 2 are the quartile 2 people. So the quartile 1s would then be shifted up to be the youngest players in the competition above, and then the quartile 2s become the oldest, and then it sort of shifts along. It's quite difficult to describe, but hopefully you can see that this idea of shifting age bands, so essentially everybody gets a chance across a season to be the oldest, and everybody gets a chance within that season to be the youngest. And that can work. That's a possible solution. I wouldn't like to be the person who is trying to administer that, but nonetheless, that probably does do quite well. You could have a system of team quotas. Maybe your team, maybe your squad needs to have a certain number of people from each of these quartiles. Maybe we could look at height and/or weight groupings. I know that New Zealand is often held up as being a country that does that particularly well. I'm not so convinced, and I think you've got to understand that New Zealand is a very different racial profile to the UK. There is a very strong Polynesian influence, again, and obviously a European influence, and increasingly an Asian influence. And these are very different people in terms of the way that they develop and so on. So the weight thing does work, but it's trying to solve a slightly different problem. It's trying to even out a slightly different problem. And then all that said, the top players play in the top competition anyway. So if you are good enough, you still play in the A competition. Where it probably does do a good job is to retain other people down below. So if you end up in the under 45 kilo head shoulders team, then at least you are playing against people who are the same weight as you, which is an opportunity. But again, as we said before, just because you're the same weight as somebody doesn't mean you're the same age. And so potentially you could have people who are very young but heavy or tall, which they can't help, playing up age groups and then being socially perhaps in the wrong place or in a place that's not ideal for them. So I think there are some positives, but there's also some negatives with the New Zealand weight banding system. There is one going around at the moment called bio banding, which is a combination of somebody's age and their weight. And again, in a tournament type structure, they organise it so that the oldest players, again, everybody has a time spending being the oldest player in a team or in a group or in a competition, but also everybody shuffles through and they all will also experience time as the youngest in that competition as well. And then finally, the big solution, which is partly what we're trying to do tonight, is coach education. There's nothing, I think the best thing we can do is just to make people aware of this. And I know there was a lot of people who left the presentation in November just saying, oh, I hadn't heard about it. And they went away and they looked at their teams and they looked at the makeup and they learned things about their players. And they didn't realise that that some of their better, the reason why their A team was their A team was in part, not all of it, but in part it was just down to age, just down to these were the older guys and girls. So partly what we're trying to do tonight is just coach education, really, and just making it, pointing it out to people that this does exist and that those other players, those quartile 3 and 4 players, or indeed anybody who needs support. Doug, see a question here from you. Much of a drop off in the academies. Good question. I'll have to come back to you on that one. I think the reality is that there is more drop off, but I'd have to come back to you now. I think a lot of the evidence that's there now is probably a little bit outdated, and I think that it probably needs to be relooked at. So I think as the awareness has gone on, that the figures that we've got available to us now probably don't quite match the understanding and the innovations and interventions that were put in place. One of the things that we're asked were how parents can help, and we said to people, be patient. If your child is a quartile 3 and 4 person, certainly you don't want to be putting that. Certainly, it'll be very clear we're not putting the kiss of death on somebody saying you're quartile 3 and 4, you're not going to make it, because it doesn't quite happen like that. But we told people to be patient, and that early sports success and youth sports is not a great predictor of later success. There was a guy just recently over Christmas, I think, it was actually in some sports it was worse. The better you were as a younger player, the worse off you were. He wasn't necessarily suggesting that was rugby, but I think we've got to be very, very aware. We've got to separate out what is youth performance and youth outcomes versus anything else. Parents and adults can help through education, and it's more important to develop technique at a younger age, and the physical will then start to even out eventually in any case. And we need to teach players to be gritty, to compete hard, to overcome challenges, teach them that sport development is not a sprint but a marathon, and help them to see areas excuse me, that they can control to become better. So ideally skill development, attitude and effort, and not to get too caught up in size and strength. And then to work on those things, and use them to their advantage. So use being a late bloomer to their advantage. Again, Sports Coach UK suggests that at these ages, the performance of a youth player is 50% skill and 50% behaviour and attitude. So the challenge to us as coaches is how much of our time is actually spent developing those behaviours and attitudes that are actually so significant in the overall performance. it's really important that as adults we ensure that all the children get playing time. If you're not playing, you're not going to improve. And the reality is that kids quit when they don't get to play. And coaches and organisations that are overly focused on results do not allow kids to play, and young players must play significant minutes in games. So I sent the parents away challenging them to make sure that they were getting game time. I'm not suggesting that that someone's running a stopwatch on the sideline by any stretch of the imagination, and clearly it's got to be an appropriate competitive opportunity. And it's not just a case of throwing the little guy on the wing against the Lomu-esque opponent just because it's his turn. Clearly we need to be setting people up for success. But then obviously the opposite goes as well, that being selected in the A team and then not getting to play isn't particularly helpful either. So there's a number of players that they want to be in the A team and then they're happy to actually not be involved. It doesn't really help. And then we go back to those 50% behaviours and attitudes, then we need to make sure that we're evening that out. I think in the best will of the world, we're wanting to have players, wanting players to have a chance to be a hero and have to have competitive opportunities where they need to play above themselves ever so slightly. But indeed, there's no harm in them being in, an old money, a B team or something like that, where they can actually be a leader and be a go-to player as well. So I think it's important that young developing players get both those opportunities. How parents can help. The only 5 words you need to know as a parent or as an adult watching children is, I love watching you play. And those 5 words encapsulate everything that you need to, encapsulates everything that a child needs to know about their relationship with their parent. And it's important that you separate your love for them from their sport performance, focus on praising them for ability and courage to be able to compete against older children. I think it's very, very difficult when I watch dads who are coaches. I always think it's a very complex relationship, and I think I always ask, how does a child know when it's the coach that's upset or when it's dad that's upset? I'm not sure that I would recognise that on a personal note. That may say something about me rather than anything else. But I think it's a very complicated thing. Got some suggested reading and so on. We will send this out in a more usable form, just part of what was presented on the day as well. There's a YouTube video called The Goldmine Effect by a guy called Rasmus Ankerson, and there's a book that goes alongside it, and I thoroughly recommend you certainly watch the video because that's about 9 or 10 minutes long, but also read the book. A TED talk called Changing the Game by a guy called John O'Sullivan. Grit by Angela Duckworth, a guy called Calvin Giles who talks about physical literacy. Animal Walks and the way that we can develop people physically. I mentioned Kevin Till earlier, who's doing a lot of relative age effect research currently, mostly in rugby league, but it's obviously a large amount of that is able to be applied. A guy called Ross Tucker, who's quite prominent on Twitter and so on. He's a sports scientist. He has a YouTube channel which goes through a number of different topics and tries to make them clearer for people. Other videos on youth and sport. An interesting article called Talent Needs Trauma. That actually having obstacles in the way of people is no bad thing, and it's those players that do overcome challenges along the way actually end up doing pretty well. And then Sports Coach UK obviously have lots of resources as well, and again I will share some of those after this. So that's the Goldmine Effect, so hopefully you can go and see that. Quite straightforward. And essentially now just a chance for any questions and Q&A. We have set up a Google community as well where people can actually put in some questions if they want to, and hopefully the discussion can keep running. And essentially, if there's any questions, I'm quite happy to take them either here for the next 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll try and copy some of this over onto the Google community. just reading Doug's question there, or comment. Yeah, there absolutely is a difference, and we need to make sure that we are grouping people appropriately. We might be, I think one of the things really interesting that, there are clubs that still have an A stream and a B, A team and a B team. And the argument's always given to me on courses is, oh, but school stream. Well, they do, but they stream by subject. So it's possible that you could be in the maths, the top math stream, but the bottom English stream and the middle science stream. Rugby is also made up of subjects. And we have the subjects that make up rugby are something like passing, running, tackling, kicking. And so equally, it's possible to be in the top passing stream, but the lowest kicking stream and the middle tackling stream. But we don't tend to do that. We tend to sort of say, we sort of lump it all together, and we say you're in the A team, and then we lump it all together, and you're in the B team. We don't do a particularly good job of breaking some of those skills down and then differentiating them on their particular need. And then related to this presentation, the danger is that we're lumping it all together largely based upon effectiveness within a game, and that effectiveness is maybe significantly based upon their size and strength. Yep. So Doug's going through and just having a look at some of his ages. So starting 15. Not quite sure what age groups that's for. So by my counts, then that 12 out of 15 are quartile 1 and 2. And so the remaining 3 players are quartile 3 and 4, if I'm reading that correctly. And as I said, a lot of this is just making that observation, or helping coaches to make an observation about their own players. So Giles, what should our overall selection criteria be? Well, I guess it depends on what your purpose is as a club and as a coach, really, what your philosophy is. I'm not sure what age group you're coaching, but if you're coaching in a competitive environment, then obviously that might be slightly sharper than something down the mini end, where it very much is that everybody should get a fair turn at the wheel. Don't underestimate the slow burners. Keep a real lookout for these slow burners. And if you have a look at the Goldmine Effect video, you'll see that Asif Appel, who the animation is about, was very much this underlying person. And the reality is there's a lot of these people around. And if I go back to the county teams, it's something that we haven't changed anything particularly, other than our awareness to look for these quartile 3 and 4 people, to actively go and look for them. I can tell you that in the under 18 side that I ran a couple of years ago, if you were in the under 15 B team, we ran 2 teams. And again, the purpose of that competition needs to be borne in mind. If you're in the under 15 B team, you had more chance of ending up being in the under 18 A team later on. So it is these guys that, with the right development, the right coaching, the right opportunity, and because we're able to run 2 teams, and because everyone got the same coaching from the same coaches and the same ideas, that these guys were able to come through. Now, I'm not suggesting that was all done purely on the basis of the Miracle County coaches or anything like that. Clearly, there's other things going on at club and school, and home, which has a significant impact. But nonetheless, it's just a case of being aware of that, really. At one of the last county trial sessions, there were quartile 1 and 2 came on the first night. It was split across 2 nights. So quartile 1 and 2 came on the first night, and there was about 100 players. And then quartile 3 and 4 came on a second occasion, and there was about 25 players. And again, my fear is that that was an under 15 age group. So these are 14 and 15-year-old players. My fear is for the game, my fear is for the county, and my fear is for them, therefore clubs, is that these players are out of the game. They're not even there to be put forward, because I don't believe that they're not good enough. I believe fully that they are good enough. But I think we've probably somehow along the way given them or not given them the support they need to develop. Okay, well, thank you all very much for listening. Hopefully the technology worked. I'm interested in any sort of feedback on that. Went a bit longer than I thought I would, but there we go. So guys, I will sign off here and look forward to some feedback as we go through. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen when I turn the feed off as to whether the live chat can keep going or not, so hopefully I don't cut anybody off, but I would redirect you back to the Google Community page. So if you search for Google, so if you go to Google Communities and then search for Sussex Rugby, you'll see that as a community, and can get some more discussion going there. Quite keen. I think we are in need of a message board. I would encourage you to participate and to push in and put in and to ask questions and so on. I think it's a place where I'm certainly keen to do more of this sort of thing. Paul, thanks very much for that comment. Yeah, I think for a lot of people who are in that situation, a lot of this starts to make more sense now. And then I think there's also some, having spoken to some coaches, I think they realise that that they're not doing anything wrong. They're only obviously any coach can only work with what they know at the time. So please don't go back and beat coaches up with they're doing the wrong thing. They're not doing the wrong thing. They're doing the best they can with what they know. And what we're trying to do is to increase coaching knowledge, and so they're just more aware of it. As I said, the reality is if you're in a cutthroat knockout cup competition, you're going to put out your best team. We understand that, but we're just trying to make sure that people are aware of the other players. And we think back to the Sussex district program. One of the key tenets of that was development is for everybody. If you're the best player in the county, you should feel you're entitled to development. And indeed, if you're the worst player in the county, that equally you should feel that you are entitled for development and there is something for you that's obviously appropriate at the same time. Cool. Okay. Well, guys, thanks very much for listening to me. It's been quite difficult to talk to myself for what took me an hour or so. A few ums and ahs. I'll listen back to that. But I think I warmed up and we got underway. Cheers, guys. Thanks very much. Have a great evening, and hopefully an hour of your time online you feel is worthwhile compared to 3 hours on the road. Thank you very much.